Good evening, and welcome. Welcome to the April program of the Metro West Climate Solutions Group. I am Jeff Barsnell, and I am a member of the steering committee. Metro West Climate Solutions, or MCS, as we've started to call ourselves, is a partnership of organizations and congregations in the Metro West region, including First Parish in Wayland, First Parish Church in Weston, First Parish in Lincoln, the Congregational Church of Weston, Sustainable Weston Action Group, otherwise known as SWAG, and a growing list of committees or communities and individuals. Our mission is to inspire sustainable, resilient, and equitable communities and host timely and relevant programs that encourage people and organizations to get involved in bringing about solutions. Many of us believe that we are living during a time of great transition, which presents opportunities and, of course, frustrations as well. This explains, the opportunities at least, explains why we are delighted to host tonight's program with Amber Hewitt, the campaign manager for offshore wind energy at the National Wildlife Federation. Amber is a Massachusetts resident based on the North Shore who has become an important leader and expert in offshore wind generation. I first met Amber 7 or 8 years ago now when she presented on renewables at a program I believe it was on the North Shore. I think it was actually at the Cumming Center, Amber. Over the last 3 to 4 years, Amber has been an effective and influential advocate for encouraging a robust planning process for developing renewable generation here in New England, especially as it pertains to offshore wind. With the passage of recent legislation here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, a change in administrations at the federal level, and a series of proposed projects off the coast of Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York, more and more attention is being paid to the promises and the challenges, both the technical and the social ones, of offshore wind power here in our region. This interest has only grown, with the nation's first offshore wind farm coming online just 3.8 miles off the coast of Block Island. I don't know, feel free to raise your hand virtually if you've seen this, the wind project off Block Island. I'm sure Amber has.
It's on the screen. Oh no, I will be sharing photos of it.
Good. This 5-turbine, 30-megawatt project has been in operation for the last 3 years and is by far the largest wind project in Rhode Island, producing more than 125,000 megawatt hours of electricity each year. This project has stimulated considerable interest in the future potential for offshore wind here in New England, with growing attention paid to its promises and, as I noted, potential issues. There are lots of questions that arise with these sort of projects. How do you connect these massive generation towers, spanning some 300 feet tall, to the electric grid, and at what cost? How do you connect these turbines even when they're out in the middle of the ocean far away from the coast? What are the impacts of these massive towers built into the seafloor on local marine wildlife and fishing, to say nothing of the birds flying by above? How reliable is the power produced by offshore wind turbines? We hope to address all those questions this evening. It is safe to say there is a growing bipartisan consensus here in New England that offshore wind power has a major role to play in decarbonizing our electric grid over the next 30 years. Both Governor Charlie Baker here in Massachusetts and former Governor Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island have formal plans in place for supporting the burgeoning offshore wind industry and the infrastructure necessary to build these huge, enormous towers that spin out in the ocean. These governors join a growing consensus of pragmatic folks around the region and country who believe that when it comes to reducing or eliminating our dependency on fossil fuels, the answer may very well be blowing in the wind. Of course, I had to use that analogy. Especially when that wind is fairly constant on a seasonal basis and predictable for planning purposes when it comes to power generation. Tonight's presentation will address several connected topics: legislative developments on offshore wind in Massachusetts and surrounding states, new hope for Vineyard Wind in Nantucket Sound, fewer turbines, a new configuration, and the project's possibilities for approval by the Board of Ocean Energy Management. Offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine, including the latest updates on projected developments, and why all of us who live in New England should consider supporting offshore wind as one of the main ways to decarbonize our region and economy, even those of us who live away from the coast. Amber is going to speak tonight for about 35-40 minutes or so, and then we will have time for questions and answers. We invite you to submit your questions as you think of them using the Q&A button, which should be on the far right side of your control panel on the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button instead of the comments button in order for us to see the question. We will then pose these questions as we during the Q&A period and answer as many of them as we can this evening. Thank you all for being here, and please join with me in welcoming Amber Hewitt to the Metro West Climate Solutions Forum.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everyone who worked to pull this together and everyone who's choosing to spend their evening here learning about offshore wind. So my name is Amber Hewitt. I've been working with the National Wildlife Federation on offshore wind advocacy for over 8 years now. As Jeff mentioned, I am based on the North Shore of Massachusetts. I'm in Newburyport, and our campaign runs along the entire Atlantic coast. So I will be speaking about offshore wind as a national opportunity this evening, but I will definitely narrow in on what is most pertinent to us here in Massachusetts as often as possible. I give these presentations in all Atlantic coast geographies, and always appreciate when I can connect with the group closer to home and talk about what's really poised to impact our energy future here in the Commonwealth and across New England. So let me get my slides on the screen and we can get started. Let's see. All right. Thumbs up, Jeff or Paul. Can you see great. Okay, thank you. So the National Wildlife Federation launched our campaign for offshore wind power a full decade ago now. This was around the time those of you who have been following climate policy for at least the past decade will recall an effort to pass a national climate bill in 2009 and 2010 that ultimately passed the House and failed in the Senate. This really sent most national environmental organizations back to the drawing board of really what are the large scale solutions when federal policy is off the table for a little while. What are the regional or executive action solutions that we can advocate for in the absence of action from Congress? When we step back and thought about large-scale climate solutions regionally, in the Northeast region, offshore wind power at that time, 10 years ago, really jumped off the map as an untapped opportunity to address climate change with solutions that could rise to the scale of the challenge, so that we could be, as a region, contributing a solution that is on par with what we faced at that time and what has only grown to be a larger challenge now. And I will say, I'll talk a bit this evening about how offshore wind is not just poised to solve our climate challenges, but also our economic and environmental justice challenges as well. We launched this essentially, though, rooted in the belief, the fundamental understanding that climate change stands as the single greatest threat to wildlife and habitat, and that we need to be able to advance large-scale solutions to that challenge, and that all large-scale development has some impact on wildlife and habitat, and that we believed then, and we believe more fervently now, that offshore wind power is going to be an enormous industry in the United States, and want to ensure that there are voices at the table advocating for wildlife protection every step of the way. So just as an overarching condition of everything you hear from me this evening, National Wildlife Federation support for offshore wind power comes with a lot of conditions. We really believe that we cannot advance solutions to one crisis, the climate crisis, while allowing those solutions to worsen, for example, the species extinction crisis. So a lot of consideration for wildlife, a lot of consideration for communities. We have actually opposed specific offshore wind projects in the past that we didn't feel measured up to where this industry needs to be because of the scale that the impact could be. So happy to answer more questions about wildlife. I'll talk a bit about it throughout the presentation, but it is a constant thread throughout all of our offshore wind advocacy. So current status of the offshore wind industry, there are just about 6,000 offshore wind turbines up and running around the world. This project on your screen now is the London Array. It's in the North Sea, and it's the largest offshore wind project on the globe. It's likely to always be the largest project. They just keep adding turbines to it. But this is the entire United States offshore wind fleet. So while there are 6,000 turbines up and running around the world, there are only 7 offshore wind turbines in United States waters. We are 3 decades behind. The first project was installed off the coast of Denmark in 1991. And the industry has scaled up really rapidly in the past 10 or 15 years. The only reason that the United States has not kept up is really a lack of political will to get it done. And I'll explain more about why that is true throughout the course of this presentation. But ultimately, what I'll share over the next few slides is why offshore wind is such a unique, an opportunity so uniquely equipped to serve the Atlantic coast of the United States right now. 10 years ago, that was true then, and it's only truer today that we are ready and able to harness this resource economically, technologically, and environmentally speaking. I start every presentation with this image, sort of consider it the offshore wind trifecta, the three images that tell us why offshore wind developers for decades have been very interested in building offshore wind power off of the Atlantic coast. On the far left, you will see just our reminder that our population is highly concentrated along our coastlines. Almost 80% of the United States population lives along coastlines. So this is a power source that is available in close proximity to the areas that need it most, those thickly settled population centers. On the middle screen, you will see an image of wind speeds all along the coast. If I were to show you a map of the entire United States, you would see the reds and oranges, those higher, more consistent wind speeds filling the middle of the country as well. So just to convey that this is on par with the wind speeds that pick up in the plains in the middle of the country, but that we don't get on land along the eastern seaboard. So to compare our land-based resource in coastal states here with the offshore resource, there's really a strong case to be made that our large-scale resource exists off of our shores. And then on the far right, you will see just an image intended to convey the water depth that we have off of the East Coast. So the fortunate geography along the Atlantic seaboard from an offshore wind perspective is that we do have this gradually sloping outer continental shelf, that lighter blue section of the water. And current offshore wind technology needs to be fixed to the seafloor, installed on piles or on jackets. I'll show images of these later. But current technology does require fairly shallow water depth so that the project can stand and be installed into the seafloor. After about 100 feet of depth, this does start to stretch out of the current capability of the industry. This is all a time-bound limitation. There's a lot of advancement underway for floating platforms, which will bring deeper water into the viability for development. Floating platforms would just need to be anchored to the seafloor with cables and could be installed in hundreds of feet of water. That would bring the West Coast into play. The water off of the West Coast of the US gets really deep really fast, so isn't accessible with current offshore wind technology. The same is true for the Gulf of Maine. The water there is too deep for fixed foundation platforms. So the pieces that need to be in play for current technology really zoom us in on the sort of Massachusetts to the Carolinas zone for ready to go for current technology. But that's not to say that future technology won't bring much more of our coastline into reach of this opportunity. Offshore wind, in addition to being a large-scale clean energy solution, is also a large-scale job creator. So right now in the United States, because we only have 7 offshore wind turbines, we do not have an offshore wind industry. Offshore wind turbines are not manufactured here in the US yet. They will be very soon. But offshore wind jobs in the US have been fairly limited to mostly operations and maintenance of our 7 turbines. So what you'll see on the screen, these are US offshore wind jobs. These are both photos that I snapped on a couple of visits to the Block Island Wind Farm off of Rhode Island. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the orange arrow pointing to someone doing some form of maintenance. At the top of that turbine, that little black speck is someone up on a harness who appeared to be cleaning a part of the tower. And then on the right-hand side, you will see a crew transfer vessel that is bringing workers to the turbine to do some maintenance. This boat that you see was built in Rhode Island, so that was some local job creation. It was built by a company owned by 3 sisters, actually, and it's the only US flagged vessel that is purpose built for transferring crew to an offshore wind turbine. The really interesting thing about these vessels is that the front of them is a large rubber bumper that heats up with the heat of the engine and then adheres to the turbine when the vessel arrives so that the crew can safely transfer while the vessel is held steady with that adhesion that you can see on the screen, and then it's able to back itself off. But operating that vessel, it's owned by a Rhode Island company, and of course the crew that is now employed to maintain these turbines. So to say we have hundreds of offshore wind jobs in the US currently is accurate, but we have a very long way to go. This industry could, by the end of this decade, host nearly an estimate of about 40,000 jobs if we stay on track with the targets that the Biden administration is setting. I'll talk more about those later. But this is the kind of manufacturing scale we can imagine in some of our deep water industrial ports that really need revitalization along the Atlantic coast. This image is in Germany. It's in a port called Bremerhaven that suffered from severe economic decline and in recent, about 10 years ago, embraced the offshore wind industry, I guess a little longer ago now, about 15 years ago, embraced the offshore wind industry and invested in this manufacturing opportunity. It's completely changed the experience of this city and has kept young people staying local because there are just new job opportunities in this exciting new industry to be a part of. This is something that we could imagine existing, revitalizing ports all along the Atlantic coast. There is so much offshore wind potential that there would need to be multiple ports like this to really serve the scale of the opportunity. So when I say tens of thousands of jobs, images like this, I think really start to pull together what that would look like. Because we're in Massachusetts, we are probably all coming with various bits of knowledge about the Cape Wind saga that played out here in the Commonwealth for really most of my early life. I remember when growing up, seeing bumper stickers for and against Cape Wind and tables at the farmers market, and never really understood why that project didn't come to be. And as I entered this field, and Cape Wind was actually still making its way through lawsuit after lawsuit and holding on to hope that it would be built, the argument that I always heard around that project was that it was just way too expensive. And it was a relatively expensive project that was now proposed about 15 years ago with earlier technology, and that technology was pricier compared to the power sources that we were relying on largely at the time. And so the story of the price tag, the 24-cent per kilowatt hour price tag that so many heard throughout that time, it really scared Massachusetts decision makers to go to bat for this resource, because especially when we're talking about such large scale development that the industry is now capable of, until we had a new price tag to apply to it, it was really the Cape Wind number that just stuck around. And with the existence in the US currently of only these small scale pilot projects are expensive as well in a per unit basis. So the power coming from the Block Island wind farm was about at that Cape Wind level, because it was so inefficiently built, in the sense that there was no manufacturing facility local. That project was built all over the world just to demonstrate what this resource is capable of. So finally, a few years ago now, Massachusetts did issue the nation's first large-scale power contract to an offshore wind developer to build an 800 megawatt project south of Martha's Vineyard, Vineyard Wind. It is equipped, ultimately, once it's up and running, I believe it will be up and running soon, it will power over 400,000 homes. And in the lifespan of this project, their price tag indicates that it will actually save Massachusetts ratepayers $1.4 billion. And the value of such large scale renewable energy development is that it does come with long-term contracts that lock in a low price. Vineyard Wind came in, compared to Cape Wind's over 20 cents a kilowatt hour, Vineyard Wind, came in around 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So in the time that Massachusetts fought it out over Cape Wind, the price tag of this development just came down significantly and has really made it more than cost competitive with fossil fuels. So for those of you who bring up offshore wind to your friends and neighbors, I'm sure that you hear that it is expensive, and I hope that I will leave you with the confidence to convey that it is absolutely cost competitive and actually slated to bring down the cost of power ultimately, largely because offshore wind provides power at our most expensive moments. So one important message to take home or to bring into those conversations or debates is that if you think about it, we max out our power grid only about 9, 10, 11 days a year when it's really cold or really hot. And so when there's a winter cold snap, for example, you can just inherently understand that when it's really cold on land, it tends to be very windy offshore. And in those most expensive moments, when we're maxing out our grid, when we're drawing on, when we need to fire up our most expensive and least efficient power plants, offshore wind is out there cranking at its hardest and could be pouring this fixed cost local clean energy into the grid and actually give us the ability to decommission those expensive and dirty power plants. So especially early offshore wind development is really setting us up to make some pretty significant transition when it comes to the cost of our energy, the spikes that New England ratepayers are so used to riding every winter. It could really buffer ratepayers from that volatility that comes with a heavy reliance on natural gas. I talked a bit about wildlife at the beginning. I can't make it through a presentation on offshore wind without talking about North Atlantic right whales. This whale that you're seeing on your screen is it's critically endangered, one of the most endangered whales in the world. There are currently about 360 of them alive in the world today. About 90 of them were recently spotted off of the Cape, so they are currently local, but they migrate up and down the entire Atlantic coast and go through every area that's slated for offshore wind development. I could spend this entire evening talking to you about the ways that we propose and advocate for the protection of North Atlantic right whales, because frankly, we can't, with a species that is on such a track toward extinction, if not for significant intervention, it's really vital that we don't allow for there to be an impact on a single one, that we certainly cannot let this offshore wind industry bring further threat to this already just horribly threatened species. So we work at National Wildlife Federation directly with state and federal regulators, as well as directly with developers, to advocate for protections that go actually above and beyond what is required of developers in law, because as you might imagine, law doesn't always keep up with science, and we have new science about the activity of these whales. on a very regular basis. So all that to say, and again, I can go deeper into this on Q&A or even in follow-up, because we just have a wealth of information on the specific measures with regard to requiring lower vessel speeds, indicating which times of year allowed construction activity can take place, using noise mitigation technology. There's all sorts of things that can be done, constant monitoring of the area during all construction activity. And I want to leave you all with the confidence that the wildlife community believes that offshore wind can move forward in a responsible way, and we're paying very close attention to the details. And that is true. I'm spotlighting one critically endangered species, but that is true with regard to whales, but also with fish and birds and sea turtles. And we have specific measures that we ask for on all of them. Here in New England, I mentioned our winter cold snaps to just sort of narrow in on it. It's not just the fact that we could benefit from offshore wind power. We actually have a real urgency to get this resource up and running as quickly as possible, because in New England, we are retiring, fortunately, legacy coal plants at a fairly rapid clip. There's only one left running in New England. And of course, there have been several recent nuclear facilities that have retired or been scheduled for retirement. So we are leaving a hole that demands to be filled. You know, there needs to be new power. Saying no to offshore wind will be saying yes to something else. And to have a utility scale local clean energy solution like offshore wind, there's really nothing like it. And I don't say that to compare offshore wind to other resources, because we support all clean energy, responsible clean energy development. But when we're talking about replacing power plants like the one that you see being demolished on the screen at Brayton Point in Somerset, Massachusetts, to replace those retirements, we need something that can match the scale of our demand and that can provide power in the moments we need it most, as we talked about with the winter cold snap. There was one particular cold snap we may still remember, going from 2017 into 2018, where there was about a 2-week period in which we burned through, just in New England, 2 million barrels of oil. Things like that shouldn't be happening in New England anymore. They don't need to be happening anymore. We don't need to be undoing so much of our climate and emissions progress in 15 cold days. We have resources available to make that a really unnecessary action. Give you a sense of scale, the offshore wind industry has been the silver lining to how far behind we are. Really is that we get to enter this industry with advanced technology and a wealth of lessons learned from our neighbors across the Atlantic, who have done the hard work of figuring out how best to build these, how to make them bigger and more efficient so that we need fewer of them. And ultimately the current turbine, like the largest and most common turbine being slated for new projects, is the one you see in the middle of the screen here. So just to give you a sense of how tall these stand and how much power they generate. This is GE's Haliade X 12 megawatt turbine. These turbines can power about 7,000 homes just on their own. So one turbine, 7,000 homes. They can power one home in 7 seconds. However you think about it, it's impressive. And of course, just they're big, and that can be daunting, particularly those of you who are joining with wildlife concern. Bigger does tend to be better, because it does mean fewer, and each machine has its impact. So we are always excited to see the industry scaling up and putting more power into each individual machine. Here's an image of what the turbines look like underwater. So this is the Block Island Wind Farm, one foundation of the Block Island Wind Farm, just 6 months after the project was installed. And you can see it's just been fully embraced by the sea life around it. It's already 6 inches thick with mussels. And that was about 3.5 years ago now. So we can imagine what it looks like today. But important to say here that, you know, there's a lot of fairly vocal concern within the commercial fishing industry and I'm happy to answer more questions about that. I certainly don't speak for the industry, but what I will say is that the concern there really is with a loss of access to portions of the seafloor. In the United States, the Coast Guard has made very clear that there is no intention of drawing any exclusion zone around an offshore wind turbine. So all vessels at the Block Island Wind Farm and at the 2 turbines that stand now off the coast of Virginia, vessels can get as close as they'd like. You can touch the turbine. I have been to visit them many times on boats and get as close as possible, while being safe, but there's no real loss. The turbines tend to be about a mile apart in large scale projects, so very safe for navigation. The Coast Guard, again, is paying very close attention to lessons learned from overseas and making sure that we put strong safety protocols in place in the US. But with a mile passage between turbines, you can just imagine and envision, even if you don't spend much time navigating the ocean, that is an incredibly wide berth, a lot of safe area for passage. What it might limit is the ability to trawl large gear behind a vessel. And so that's really what it comes down to, sort of the trade-off behind leaving every bit of fishing ground that is currently open, available, and accessible. Gear could certainly tangle on a turbine. I don't imagine that it is inviting to drag football field sized gear through an offshore wind farm when after being used to not having those kinds of obstacles for so long. So that's really where this comes down to is access, sharing the ocean. From a wildlife perspective, I always like to emphasize that fish are wildlife. We care and advocate for the protection of fisheries in all offshore wind development. And what we know is that recreational fishing individuals and charter boat captains are enthusiastic about the offshore wind industry because of exactly what you see on the screen, and that these turbines form artificial reefs that actually serve as great fishing hotspots for those who fish. And that ultimately this is something that we know absolutely can represent strong shared use of the ocean, but new development impacting an already heavily impacted industry does definitely cause significant distress and lots of headlines. So something that you certainly, if you haven't heard about, you definitely will as offshore wind advances in the off of the Northeast. Give you a sense of where things stand currently. So I mentioned that there are only 7 offshore wind turbines standing in US waters. That doesn't mean that we are starting from scratch. We have a ton of work that has already taken place to put us really on the cusp of pretty significant development. Starting in 2013, the Obama administration began leasing areas of federal waters for offshore wind development. So that had never happened before, but the Interior Department, once you go 3 miles from shore, we're now in federal waters. So the Interior Department needs to conduct a multi-year stakeholder engagement process to find areas of least conflict, to extensively survey and assess those areas, and ultimately draw on a map what ends up being an offshore wind lease area. So every colored block that you see on the screen has gone through that process sometime between 2013 and today. And these indicate current offshore wind lease areas. So once the lease area is drawn, the Interior Department holds an auction. Offshore wind developers bid, and the highest bidders win the right to ultimately build a project in that area. So once an offshore wind developer wins a lease, then they begin a multi-year process of planning a project, of getting that project permitted with the federal government, goes through a lot of scrutiny, extensive public comment opportunity, and they need to also secure a contract, most likely with a state who's willing to buy that power. So there is a state process and a federal process here. The federal government leases these areas to developers, and then the states have been the buyers of the power. I say have been because it could be possible for, say, a private entity to issue a contract to a developer, But to date, all of the contracts with offshore wind developers have been directly with states and utilities. Zooming in a bit, just to give you a sense of what's happening closer to home. So those wind energy areas stretch from Massachusetts to North Carolina right now, but in Massachusetts, or off of Massachusetts, we have all of the areas that you see here on the screen, and they're all in various stages of being ready for development or operation. Again, these are multi-year processes, but every name that has contracted under it means that indicates a power contract with a state. So those are sort of, that means the developer has a lease, they have a contract, so someone will buy their power and they can begin the process of getting their project permitted with the federal government. Well, we spent the past 4 years, it's so much more pleasant to give offshore wind presentations now because I can have real hope in my voice about what is to come. I did, of course, talk about offshore wind for all 4 years of the previous administration, and things did not stand still, but there were significant delays. There was very little organization around getting this done. There is bipartisan support for offshore wind, though, and that is really important to note. It's why things didn't stand still or move backward for the past 4 years when so many important environmental causes did. Offshore wind was kind of standing out as something that was chugging along, really because it's large-scale US infrastructure, it's a job creator, it's US energy, so that's it really was able to fit within the narrative of the past administration. But today, things are just we're in a whole new day on so many levels. And on March 29th, the Biden administration made an unprecedented set of announcements about their commitment to offshore wind power. So it was a joint announcement between the Secretaries of Commerce, Energy, Interior, and Transportation, all making commitments to their pieces of the puzzle. The headline is really that the administration committed to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind power deployed by 2030. So that's 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind power deployed by 2030. 30,000 megawatts is the goal. Currently, we have 42 megawatts in operation. So we have an incredibly far way to go. It might sound, when I put it like that, 42 to 30,000 megawatts, like an impossible feat, but the reality is we actually are well on our way there. So my final slide this evening is a snapshot of where things stand at the state level, because frankly, the federal government is setting high goals and putting out a really ambitious roadmap, but we cannot fulfill offshore wind goals without state action, because as I mentioned, states need to agree to buy the power. So on the far left, you'll see these three donuts here kind of capture the offshore wind status in states along the Atlantic coast. On the left, state policy commitments. These states around that ring there are all of the states that have set an offshore wind policy goal. And you can see what those numbers are, what they've committed to. And Massachusetts really stands strong there. New York and New Jersey certainly have eclipsed our early commitments, but they have a much larger power demand, so we can't feel too badly about it. Massachusetts has really continued to keep up, increasing its offshore wind goal as the technology advances and the state of the industry indicates that it's smart to do so. And I think really to just keep up with both the increased climate goals and the fact that we're drawing this power from federal waters. So those areas that I showed you here, these are the only areas that offshore wind development can take place until new areas are drawn. So that's sort of a parallel process that the Biden administration is committed to. But for right now, these are the areas we've got to work with, and a lot of them are already accounted for. So because this is federal waters, this power can be delivered to any state willing to pay for the longest cable. So this power is going to Massachusetts, to Rhode Island, to Connecticut, and to New York currently. So there is definitely a competitive factor of setting a high offshore wind goal and indicating to the industry that your state is really in the game, ready to play, and wants to potentially be hubs for manufacturing and workforce training. So there's been, I think, a healthy competition across state lines to drive these numbers up in recent years, because that left donut of policy commitments really started with Massachusetts passing an offshore wind commitment in 2016. It was the first of its kind. It was the first state to set a real time-bound, megawatt-specific offshore wind goal, and it inspired others to follow. As you will understand, it's really, I advocated heavily for that bill. It was really my first advocacy project, and I spent 3 years on it. And it's hard to convince legislators and governors to do something first and to do something new, but especially in Massachusetts, where we had a Republican governor who did not really convey any sort of enthusiasm for the offshore wind industry. He had spoken critically of Cape Wind, and we had the Cape Wind story weighing us down as something that was already being perceived as a bit of a failure, even though it wasn't quite out of the question yet. So we had a lot of cards stacked against us, and ultimately the case for offshore wind, it really begins to sell itself when you're looking at current technology, when you're looking at the need to replace power plants. Nothing else stands up that can measure up to that right now. So Massachusetts kicked off the movement that really put those numbers around that circle. The middle circle, this is where things really start to come to be. So states can set their policy commitments, but then there's a matter of, are they really moving? Are they really implementing them? Are they issuing power contracts? Are they staying on or ahead of schedule? These are the states that have issued significant amounts of power contracts, giving offshore wind developers the green light to start planning their project and submitting their permit applications to the federal government. So you can see there also Massachusetts is holding its own, although New York is kind of in a league of its own. And finally, as we've talked quite a bit about tonight, that in terms of operational projects, Rhode Island has a lot to be proud of as the little state that is leading the way, and really has given us the ability to access offshore wind turbines, to bring decision makers out to see and experience them, to bring advocates out to feel the power of this resource. Because when I first started advocating for offshore wind in 2013, we didn't have that luxury of being able to actually help people experience offshore wind in all of its power. And so having these pilot projects up and running in the United States has really been a game changer in helping people to understand what the resource is capable of. So there is an immense advocacy need here. While we do have champions in the federal government, there is a ton of advocacy needed at the state and local levels to make sure that the details come together in a way that communities feel good about. These projects need to land power cables in communities. That is always controversial. There is impact concerns on, or just concern within communities on what the impacts of these projects are. We need help with public education, sharing with your friends and neighbors that this is worth supporting and being an advocate for. So I do hope that those of you who have just gone through this journey with us this evening are inspired to speak up. And I'm always happy to, of course, take questions now and then to follow up and work together in the future.
Great. Thank you, Amber. Great presentation, covered a lot of ground, very helpful. We have been getting questions, and let's just start with a couple clarifications. You cited the 7 cent per kilowatt hour cost of Vineyard Wind, I believe the Vineyard Wind project?
Yes.
That does not include transmission distribution, right? That's just generation.
That's right. Yep.
So just like we're comparing apples to apples, like when we talk about generation of coal or gas or whatever, I mean, it's broken up in a different cost. So is the transmission cost higher as a result of it being offshore in terms of interconnection?
Great question. It is not. So the cost of building the transmission, I mean, it is called offshore wind transmission. I kind of think of it as more of like a lead line, an extension cord. It's the power line that runs 10 or 20 miles, depending on how far the project is from shore, into the existing grid. So that's built into the cost of that developers bid forward for the power. The developer absorbs the cost of building that line, or their utility partner, whoever it is. So there is no additional transmission
The
cost.
cost of transmission through the water is baked into the cost of the generation of the project cost.
Yes.
Okay, that's an important piece here that that I think sometimes people forget. Bringing the power on shore is another whole issue, but there are major points of interconnection where we can do that in Massachusetts. I know one of them in Salem, for example.
Yes.
But there are others on the South Shore as well that can feed right into the grid.
Absolutely.
All right. Let's see. Tom, I'm gonna come back to your question a little bit. Are wind turbines noisy? We've gotten a couple different versions of this question, both tonight and in advance. I had a couple of people sending me questions in advance or sending us questions beforehand, which was very helpful. What about the problems with sound coming from wind turbines? How does it affect local animals?
Sure. So I'm an offshore sailor, so I spend a lot of time out on the water in the wind. And really what you hear when you're near a wind turbine is it's drowned out by the wind, because if the wind is strong enough to move these enormous machines, then it is the wind that you're hearing. Also, the turbines stand 600 feet above the sea floor. So you do hear sort of a gentle whir on occasion, especially if it's a calmer day. But on a windy afternoon, you're really only hearing the strong wind offshore. It's a noisy environment. From a wildlife impact standpoint, none of the data from Europe, we have 30 years of data to draw from there, indicates that there's any impact on wildlife from sound. So we consider it really negligible. Particularly, a lot of our concern is about marine wildlife, as I mentioned, and the noise concerns that we have are all related to construction. So construction of offshore wind turbines is extremely loud. You need to hammer these towers into the sea floor with current technology, though there are other foundations under development that are a little quieter, and we're really excited about them. Sort of a concrete block, for example, that could rest on the sea floor. But ultimately, once they're up and running, we do not have a noise concern.
So I know the project, the 5 turbine project off Block Island. I think it's 3.5 miles off of Block Island.
Yes.
Have there been any complaints on Block Island from residents about these noisy wind turbines? I mean, the summertime isn't as strong. In the wintertime, there's not as many people on Block Island.
Right. So there really aren't. I mean, it's significant view impact. I will say that when you're on Block Island, there's an expression on Block Island, that dates well before the offshore wind project was there, that you only notice the wind on Block Island when it's not blowing, because it is always windy. It stands out when it's not. So they're used to just hearing the sounds of wind. And again, the turning of the blades does not cut through that and reach the island by any measure. But the real, not everyone loves the visual impact of the project. I mean, being only 3 miles from shore and being 600 feet tall, you really see and feel them on most parts of the island. So as an offshore wind advocate, I think it's a beautiful expression. As the only community that is entirely powered by offshore winds and that was able to decommission their diesel generator, a lot of people love the story. Not everyone loves the impact, though.
Yeah, and I believe the power costs on Block Island dropped significantly as a result of that.
By about 40%. They were bringing 1 million gallons of diesel fuel to the island every year on ferries. So very expensive. And that cost is reflected in every part of life on the island. When I was there advocating for the project in 2014, 2015, locals were really expressing concern about being priced out of the place that they had lived for 10 or 12 generations. Hotels were paying 5-figure electric bills every month. So in the summer, to run air conditioners, it was almost out of the question. So it really changed the economic experience on the island.
It's a game changer, no doubt. Several questions about the status of federal permits in Massachusetts and in other states in New England. People are curious about where the activity is. We know about Vineyard Wind. What is the status of the permits in Massachusetts?
So Vineyard should have been permitted about 2 years ago. The former administration put that on a significant delay with the explanation that they needed to do a cumulative impact analysis. So they needed to pause the multi-year delay that was almost complete to actually consider the impact of the entire offshore wind industry in the Atlantic coast and the cumulative effect of so many projects being built. So that process took place. That concluded in August of last year. And then just recently, the Biden administration issued a final environmental impact statement for the project. So that's the last step in the permitting process, tells us what their impact is. And ultimately, the record of decision, which is the final green light. No offshore wind project has ever gotten one in the US, so it will be a big moment when it happens. It was actually due to come out on April 21st. So just last week, we're hearing just some final, like dotting the I's, crossing the T's things happening, but that we should expect to see it next week or the week after. So we could be on the cusp of a really exciting announcement that I hope everyone will share far and wide, because it will mark a new day for this industry.
That would be a major turning of the page or a new chapter. When they receive that permit, is there some sort of timeline then that would kick in regarding when they get steel in the water, or would they be able to project when that project might commence construction?
If they get their permit within the next couple of weeks, they're projecting that it's really a 2-year construction window until they're fully operational. Could be a little sooner than that. Early 2023 though is what is projected for. And I should say this project, because it's the first and only large scale project that will have a permit, won't be manufactured in the US. There hasn't been enough of a project pipeline to warrant building a manufacturing facility here. So it'll go into construction right away and then make its way across the
shift over.
Yeah.
Amber, several questions about other states. So we know New York is actively pursuing this. There has been reports recently about the discussions and debates going on in Maine with the lobster fishermen industry, or lobster fishermen association, coming out and expressing concerns and criticism of the governor's ovation, I would say, proposals. There's nothing really formal, I gather, but what your thoughts on that in terms of impacts on lobstering?
Yeah, so Maine it's a little further behind time-wise because of having deeper water and therefore needing floating technology, which is really only in the pilot scale right now. There's, for example, 5 turbines off of Scotland that are up and running, but their floating technology is really like the next chapter. And there is a model scale turbine that was developed by the University of Maine, and the state really has expressed hope to be a part of pioneering this next phase of offshore wind into practice. When Governor Mills came in, she followed someone who had very strongly objected to all wind power development, and so the conversation was just not happening, So I think people were able to just kind of have confidence that the former governor was not going to let any offshore wind development happen in any real way. And then within a few days of her term, she was expressing positive commitments to exploring this opportunity. And that's what's really important to convey, is that Maine is at a phase of exploring the opportunity. They're looking to build a 12 turbine research array to really understand what the impacts of floating turbines are. We don't know, we're really in the research gathering phase. If there's a significant impact to lobsters in the Gulf of Maine, this industry has no future. That is an incredibly powerful entity and a beloved species and a cultural, we don't have to worry about that. That is what they want to research. So of course, though, any sort of new proposal of development is going to scare people that depend and make their living on the water. And I think that's what we're really seeing, is fear of the unknown in that community. Sure. I mentioned that with fishing, there's no exclusion zone around turbines, but with floating turbines, the expectation is there probably would be an exclusion zone because they'll have cables in the water column.
Yeah,
So,
you wouldn't want to go too close to a certain radius or a circle, if you would. Although
right.
my understanding is with the floating turbine technology, it's intended for deeper water
Yes.
where you may not be fishing as much, or they could anchor these things or moor these things in areas that aren't uh,
Much further from shore.
much further from shore, which is the real appeal, because then you don't have to build a foundation, right? You can
Right.
just let
Right.
that thing, enormous structure, float in the middle of the ocean.
And construction is quieter. You just tow it out to its.
Tow it out, yeah. I mean, it's actually it's unbelievable they're even considering it, but that would be a long time away compared to the current technology of a foundation on the sea floor.
Probably a decade away. I think it's really important to just assure those who are concerned that this is information gathering and will be in that phase for a very long time.
All right, let's see. Uh, we have a question about, we asked about the noise. Someone's asking about their buying of green power, that they buy power through the Green Energy Consumers Alliance. Way to go. Join the club. I do that as well. A lot of people I know do. It feels very indirect to buy green power that way, and not very effective because the Eversource electricity that I actually use in my house is coming from the default package. Well, it depends on how you look at it. Is it useful for me to pay for generation of this other electricity? Can I choose a green wind supplier straight through Eversource?
I
Not
don't
right
think
now.
so. No.
I don't think so. But by virtue of purchasing renewable energy certificates through the Green Energy Consumers Alliance, you are stimulating the regional market for renewable power, including offshore wind power, solar, and distributed hydro, and the like. And by virtue of doing that, you actually you create, if you will, the future market for the awarding of more offshore wind contracts in New England. That's how I would answer the question, but what do
That's how I would answer it too. I have nothing to add. That was excellent.
Let's see. Okay, so we have some technologists here in our midst who are already thinking about synergies with different types of renewable power generation. We've heard about wave power and tidal power. Can these be combined with offshore wind power? Are they too site specific? I think of the Bay of Fundy and high tides, or too small to even bother with.
That's a great question. I'm not entirely equipped to answer it. I've been going to offshore wind conferences for almost a decade now, and it's always something that's kind of on the fringe, like as an idea that we should keep in mind, and that pilot projects are happening at universities to consider. I'm not sure in terms of, my understanding is that it's at the very early stages of consideration. It's not in practice anywhere, but we'd certainly be really excited to explore and better understand the way to make the most of this kind of infrastructure development.
At this point, my understanding is that there are only so many specific regions or areas that have the ideal conditions where you can harness waves in a way that makes sense economically speaking. And so it is the Bay of Fundy's out there, which is, there's not too many geological configurations like that on the planet. But I know I was at a conference years ago where they suggested there's this small Portuguese company called Palamas that makes these floating machines. So for those of you technicians out there, check out the Palamas machine if you're interested. Let's see. I missed your point about how far from shore the U.S. has jurisdiction to allow or regulate these structures. Could you discuss that?
Yes. So federal water starts 3 miles from offshore, and then really it goes to 200 miles offshore and until you're reaching international water. So I can't imagine an offshore wind project would ever even approach the 200-mile from shore zone. The transmission challenge would be too much. But all projects will be at least 3 miles from shore. Building in state waters, which is actually what happened off of Block Island because they have a state waters ring around the island. It comes with really significant wildlife impacts, major view challenges. And the trajectory of the industry is to go as far from shore as possible, because that's where the wind is strongest and most consistent, and the areas have the least conflict. So it is very likely that, I mean, the whole first phase of offshore wind, all those areas I showed on the map, they're between 10 and 30 miles from shore. And that's really the sweet spot, though, that will go a little further out once floating turbines come into
So you'd barely see them, and you would, for the most part, never hear them. In other words,
you'll never hear them. You can see like the Block Island Wind Farm from the mainland. It's 17 miles from shore. So on a perfectly clear day, you can see a tiny speck on the horizon if you know where to look. But for the most part, these will be really almost impossible to view from shore, because it's so rare that there's a perfectly clear day from shore and we're
sure.
just over the horizon line.
All right, Michael P. Has a good question. What is the optimal mix of wind, solar, and energy storage to minimize peak power requirements in our New England climate? I would depend on the season. I know that just right off the bat. But as we decarbonize our grid, what are the discussions about how are we going to mix wind and solar and storage on a seasonal basis, Amber? I know NREL just came out with a report about that.
They did, yes, and we need all of it. I mean, I think it's so hard to start putting those numbers together, because on every front, we just need to be at full speed ahead. And with offshore wind, I mean, while it is capable of meeting all of Massachusetts energy needs, it is not windy all the time, and seasonally speaking, or times of day, it's generating better than others. It does operate with a 60% capacity factor, about 50 to 60, which is really strong for renewable energy, but it absolutely needs to be complemented by solar, by land-based wind, and with significant storage improvement. All offshore wind projects proposed today do have some storage component to them, and hopefully we'll only see that increase in the years ahead.
One vision I've heard is, scale up renewables, including offshore wind, as much as possible. And then during times of excess capacity, when there's a whole lot of wind blowing, generate synthetic fuels that can be run through gas pipelines and use that when the wind's not blowing, or it's a cloudy day, or when you actually need it. That's one vision that I've just recently heard about that I found absolutely fascinating, which means that we should not rip out our gas infrastructure, delivery infrastructure just yet. We should hold on to it, even if we're not going to use it, or try to depend less on it. By the way, some of these questions can be explored and answered at the ISO New England website, which has a lot of awesome information about our electricity, the regional grid, how it works, and how it could work better. Let's see, a couple final questions, and then we're going to stop. Although I'm impressed that we still have a big group who's sticking on on Zoom here. People, there's been some questions about ways to reduce the impact of the pylons and the underwater foundations for these turbines. Can they be fitted with sensors that would reduce the speed and revolution during critical migration periods? Is there, what technologies are available to reduce the impact on wildlife?
So this, we could have a whole evening to talk about. There is so much, because I feel like I say so many times, we're 30 years behind. So we have a lot of technology that's already in use as a regular practice, and then a lot that's in development. I talked a lot about the noise of construction, of hammering the towers into the sea floor. So we do advocate for specific time of year restrictions for when whales, for example, are not migrating through the area. But of course, wildlife travel off schedule all the time. So we also need to have constant monitoring in place to make sure that when any vulnerable wildlife comes into the area, that all loud construction stops. So that's sort of the low-tech approach. But then ultimately, the industry would like to be able to be constructing these turbines year round to get the projects online faster. We're talking about 2-year construction projects. And so that's where we call for the implementation of technology. For example, there's a a technology called bubble curtains, which blows air around the entire hammering activity. So it absorbs a lot of the sound. You can have double or triple bubble curtains to have layers of sound absorption. The turbines can be stopped. They're all controlled from substations, either on land or really like probably from someone's iPhone at this point, that can be turned off in critical migration moments. That's not something that we anticipate really needing to happen, because the avoiding of migration pathways really takes place in the siting process. So that's something that is already incorporated, that we would never advocate for a project to be built in a migration pathway, which we really know where they are going that far offshore. The time where turbines will be stopped, though, is when wind speeds, for example, during a hurricane, if wind speeds get too high. Right now, it's usually at about 55 or 60 miles per hour, depending on the specific turbine. They will stop and feather into the wind to avoid friction and be able to ride out the storm, and therefore should be ready to handle a Category 4 hurricane.
Yeah, people are surprised to learn that there's actually a cut in and a cut out speed for most wind turbines. So there's a speed that's slow enough for it so it's not really generating power. And if the speeds exceed a certain amount, then the wind turbines are designed these days to cut out or trim their blades, just to, because you definitely do not want to damage a machine that's that expensive and that hard to repair. Let's see, a couple more, then we're going to conclude this. Any activity up in the Canadian Maritimes that you've heard about?
I've heard interest. I haven't heard of any like real activity, but just before COVID, so I guess it would have been in 2019, there was a meeting of the New England governors and Canadian premiers, and it was all about offshore wind and really sharing ideas. And there's water depth challenges there as well, so it would likely be a floating conversation, but there's definitely interest.
Great. I know there's some interest on the Great Lakes as well. And
Yes.
and any of you who have cousins or friends up in Nova Scotia, tell them to get busy. Let's see. Finally, is it Tom McGee asks, is it the state that buys or contracts to buy the power, or is it the electric company? How can we put pressure on our utilities, on our suppliers? How can we spur on this transition to renewables, Amber?
I love this question. I mean, our utilities are the hardest entity to influence, certainly. In this mix, I will say the least subject is public pressure. That said, it is the utilities that buy the power, but it is all because either the legislature or the governor or both are requiring them to buy that power. So in every case of offshore wind development, every policy commitment, every contract has been preceded by either a bill or an executive order requiring utilities to buy a certain amount of offshore wind by a certain time. So that's really our leverage point with our elected officials, to insist on setting offshore wind goals that really measure up to the need. In Massachusetts, we actually got a bill introduced this year that would remove the ceiling for offshore wind development. So right now we have a 5,600 megawatt commitment that was part of the climate bill that just passed, increased our offshore wind goal to 5,600 megawatts, which is okay. It's, we have a long way to go to meet that. So it's fine for right now, but the scale of this industry is only going up. The need for offshore wind in Massachusetts is much higher than that. That's only about a third of our power demand in peak moments, a little more than a third. So we ultimately, our goal is just to remove the cap and say, let's have the goal of 5,600 megawatts be a minimum rather than a maximum. So that bill is introduced. I can share resources. For anyone who would like to get involved in advocating for it, we anticipate hearings in the fall and hopefully can get that on the books this session.
Yeah, anyone who is interested in that should Google the Renewable Portfolio Standard and understand how that works. The utilities are obligated to purchase a certain amount of their electricity from renewable generation, and within that, there's actually carve-outs for solar and now for wind, which is exciting. I think one final question for you, Amber. We're going to invite you back in 10 years. All right. So in 2031, we'll invite you back. What in 10 years time, how will you define success? What would make you happy to come back and report to us in terms of what transpires in the next decade here in New England?
In 10 years, it's the perfect measure of time because that is really where we should have met this new goal that was just set by the Biden administration. We should have 30 gigawatts of offshore wind deployed, up and running in the grid. So my measure of success will be that we've reached that goal and that it has happened in a way that wildlife advocates can feel good about, that it was built responsibly and really had minimal impact on wildlife and habitat, that it employed local communities with union jobs, that this is a really high quality family sustaining job creator and we treat it as such in this country, and that the benefits of offshore wind reach everyone, and especially communities that have been disproportionately impacted by our historical reliance on fossil fuels. So there is an economic, a justice, and a conservation component of this that is really important to me in doing it right, that we don't just want to build a huge industry that has another decade of detrimental impacts. Even though it's clean, it can still have impacts, and we need to make sure that we seize all the benefits we can for communities and wildlife.
Fair enough. Good answer. I want to thank you for being here tonight. Very interesting presentation. Great discussion. I want to thank Paul Penfield for being our curator of questions behind the scenes. Nice job, Paul Penfield. I do want to remind everyone that we will be hosting a program on local plants and climate change and how to build resilience in your garden. That's already very popular. It looks like we have a bunch of people have already subscribed to that, and that will be on May, I'm going to get this wrong, May 19th, is that right? I think it's May 19th. Check out MetroWestClimateSolutions.org for all the information about that program and future programs in June and then in the fall. Thank you, Amber Hewitt from the National Wildlife Federation. We did include your URL there, and we will have information about this presentation and how to contact you and how to follow up on our website.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Really,
yes, thanks for coming.
Everyone will keep in touch. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
You too. Thanks.
And stay sustainable.